Nokia, Samsung, Huawei, Tesla, Myanmar General, Motorola. Nokia, Samsung, Huawei, Tesla, Myanmar General, Motorola. Chopé, oh les deux, nous avons peur des vos révolutions. Nous avons peur des
In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, thousands of people make up the workforce that is bringing about a new energy revolution. They are digging for a mineral that the world market is snatching up: cobalt. On the other side of the world, thanks to this metal needed for batteries, the industry builds, assembles, and markets electric cars. In the race against climate change, cobalt is one of the keys to driving without polluting. But at what cost? In Europe, cars and road transport are responsible for a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. Starting in 2035, the sale of combustion vehicles will be banned in the European Union. This decision affects the entire production chain of the sector. All major car brands, Volkswagen, Renault, BMW, and Volvo, are investing in this new market, which is necessary for our green mobility.
If you want to achieve the climate neutrality in 30 years, we need to use all the technologies which are available. We are now undisputed number one if it comes to investment into the battery sectors. We have more than 120 billion euros of investment over the last 3 years, which is 3.5 times more than the money invested in China in the same sector. And that we are going to create a lot of jobs and, as I said, completely new industry.
In Europe, most batteries are based on NMC, nickel manganese cobalt, technology, which allows vehicles to drive about 400 kilometers on a single charge. In addition to lithium, manganese, and nickel, these batteries contain about 10 kilograms of a metal that gives them their longevity and safety: cobalt.
The vast majority of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's essentially because there isn't really anywhere else in the world which has the same grades or mineralogy for cobalt as the Congo. There isn't really any other country in the world which can claim to have the same quality of deposits, quality of reserves. It's almost like the Saudi Arabia of cobalt.
Congo has been blessed or cursed, depending on how one looks at it, with extraordinary geological mineral wealth. And it's always been strategic, whether it was in the 19th century, rubber, or the middle of the 20th century, uranium, or more recently, the question of strategic critical minerals for the agenda that the international community has adopted, the consensus that we need to move to carbon neutral emissions in the world requires electric vehicles, it requires renewable energy, all of which require strategic minerals coming out of the Congo. First and foremost, one could say, would be cobalt.
Kolwezi, the cobalt capital of the world. We are in the heart of the copper belt that runs under the Congo and neighboring Zambia. A landscape shaped by a century of mining. It is here, in the Lualaba and Katanga provinces, that most of the copper and cobalt deposits are located. foreign companies exploit this tremendous wealth. Of the 19 industrial copper and cobalt mines, 15 are owned by Chinese companies. They share extraordinary asset with the Swiss giant Glencore, which holds 2 of the most productive mines in the world, and with the Eurasian Resources Group.
Cobalt is transported normally by truck down to South Africa. It's loaded on ships in Durban, and then it's shipped from Durban to China, where it's processed into battery chemicals, and from there it ends up in the wider supply chain. Right now, global demand for cobalt is in the region of 140,000 tons, 150 maybe, but we're expecting that to rise to 250 in the next 5 years. There's a lot of new demand which is going to come onto the market, and we're going to need to find supply for it.
Cobalt can fetch up to $70,000 a ton on the world market. A mineral that coexists in copper deposits, it has whetted the appetite of mining companies since the boom of the battery market 10 years ago. These companies are constantly nibbling away at the land to the detriment of the inhabitants, most of whom live on less than $2 a day.
We, the people who live next to the mining operation, I think you have seen what the town of Kolwezi is like. You have seen that there are no schools, there are no hospitals, there are no roads, and the people have no access to drinking water. And those who have access to water, it is not drinking water. It is a water where acids are poured. Even nature has made some villages have their streams, but they are already polluted. So mining activity is impoverishing the population rather than improving the living conditions of the people here.
The industrial mines of Lualaba and Upper Katanga produce 80% of Congolese cobalt. The remaining 20% comes from artisanal mines. Under orange tarps, diggers work at the bottom of shafts and tunnels several dozen meters down. Donatien Bila is one of these artisanal diggers. There are 150,000 like him in the region. They've come from all over the country to escape poverty and get their share of the mining windfall.
Vie compliqué ngana kin na boulot na bando sala, ngani ngana musala, leo ba bingani ngana musala, de famille réclamer nga koto balibite oko souffrir kuna te na bando futela bandaku, ko moyen na futela bandaku ana sali kufi. Les familles bisinga ke yaka na kolezi cobalt ezari ba minerais ezali ko se retrouver ndenge na ye awa na se retrouver na za creuser na Kamilombe de première fois na nga agrésage.
Cobalt. Oui, tu peux prendre quelque chose, tu le montres avec le doigt. Voyons, c'est ça.
Les artisanal, les arts au na libulu, zokata, la barre de mine. Après kokata, tobimi, basalizer basali, bakokita, bazozwa basak ba matisa ngo likolo. Na peut-être sozo comprendre. Biso to kokata to china basak, to étaler yango, etikali, tomati. Basalizer bae, bazui sak moko ba matisa ngo likolo. Après toke na mai, sokoli yango epa ba mama. Tu futi bato mai, tu futi basalizer, et après tu es dans la maison tout est qui. La banda qui kobanga posa tana kufwa. Bala liboso wana seki na tremble ba seka kinga mabe. Seka kinga mabe bala liboso wana ba seka kinga mabe ba sekinga na tremble. ti nazo trembler boye mais tellement souffrance na kotikaka. Temaka mwa mbali pona kitaka e bandeli wana nazolenga.
Diggers die in cave-ins and floods, but thousands of families rely on the crumbs of cobalt that the state and the industry allow them to exploit. A way to buy social peace. For the last 20 years, the government has been trying to organize this sector into a legal mining zone. The law now forces the artisanal miners to join cooperatives. But these structures are in fact very hierarchical, and the miners have no share or say in the management of their mine.
Artisanal mining is a really important thing to track because it's probably the only source of swing supply in the cobalt market. It's the only source of cobalt supply which can go up or down depending on prices. The vast majority of cobalt mined today is either a byproduct of copper or a byproduct of nickel. And if you own a massive copper cobalt mine, for example, the vast majority of your money is made on the copper. So if the price of cobalt suddenly shoots up, you're not going to increase your production rates because you care only about the copper. It's great that the price of cobalt's going up and it increases your cobalt value, but you're not going to increase supply to meet that additional demand. You can't because it's a byproduct. The one exception to that, more or less, is artisanal mining.
Ça c'est des vrais cobalt. La production ya libulu na ngai ceux qui tosali tongo tipo quoi tozosala 350 colis.
350.
Sac avec le vrai balance. Les sacs ça pèse 20 kilos avec les Chinois. Et vont casser. Ils vont tricher les balances pour mettre 10 kilos, de 20 à 10. Mais normalement c'est 20 kilos.
At the buying counters, the diggers sell mainly to Chinese buyers, independent entrepreneurs who have rushed to the Congo. They first process the ore before exporting it to the smelters.
This was my first trip to Kolwezi. You know, what struck me most was just how the whole city was built around the mining industry. Around and on top of these minerals. And just this very, very, very strong feeling that these people, the people living there should be benefiting from this extraordinary wealth, which is generating prosperity for Chinese companies, European companies, American companies, but they're suffering. The creuseurs, the diggers, were risking their lives and their health to dig this metal out. They were also not receiving, probably very few were receiving a fair price for their labor. They were being exploited financially. We found that children as young as 7 or 8 were also involved in this industry. No family wants their children to work. No child, no 7-year-old wants to be spending all day entering illegally into the compound and spend all day picking up stones from the ground at risk of being beaten or robbed. No one wants to do that. They're doing that because they're forced by the circumstances.
In 2016, Amnesty International published a report that shook the automotive industry. The NGO blamed companies that produced batteries for using cobalt tainted by human rights violations, such as the use of child labor in artisanal mines.
We wanted to know where this cobalt went. Who was buying this? Which companies, which tech companies, you know, the mobile phone manufacturers and the laptop manufacturers were using this cobalt in their batteries? And what were they doing to understand this supply chain and understand these conditions? The response we got to this report, drawing the links to, you know, from, you know, child labor, artisanal mining, the cobalt industry, linking these mines to these famous brands, had a massive media pickup, much more than we were expecting.
No company, car manufacturer, or other end consumer of cobalt wants to be labeled as benefiting from child labor. It's terrible publicity. It hurts share value. If it is wrong, and consumers don't like it. So it's bad for business. Even if you are ethically atrophied and don't care about ethics, if you're only self-interested, you should still be against it because it's bad for business.
Child labor isn't the only problem facing automakers. Switching to electric cars has made them discover their immense dependence on Congolese cobalt and the battery cells that contain it, which are essentially manufactured in Asia. To develop a battery industry, Europe set up a major industrial strategy in 2017.
If you want to make sure that Europe will also in the future produce the best, but also this time most sustainable cars, you cannot simply do it if you import a battery from somewhere else without that traceability, without respecting all the standards, without making sure that the carbon footprint is low as possible. And therefore we started with the European Battery Alliance, and therefore we are doing this, I would say, fantastic catching up with China. This is actually not only good for Europe and good for tackling the climate change, but there are very clear benefits for the local communities in the form of new jobs, new investment possibilities, and clear commitment that everything has to be done 100% sustainable.
Europe was only responsible for 3% of the world's battery production. To catch up, it plans to build about 30 gigafactories by 2035 and thus produce 25% of the world's supply. In Sweden, acres and acres of forest have been wiped away to make way for this new technology. The Swedish company Northvolt is building a gigafactory, the first of its kind for a European group that aims to compete with Asian producers.
Northvolt was founded almost 5 years ago by Peter Carlsson, a Swedish guy, and Paolo Cirutti, an Italian guy. They found each other working for Tesla. Being European, both of them, they then obviously start to look towards Europe, which is a part of the world where we have 20-something million vehicles produced every year. We have 13, 14 million people working in this industry. And if you believe the hypothesis that all of these cars that we produce are going to go electric, not having batteries produced at scale is always going to be a critical thing for Europe. And that was sort of the premise for how the idea of Northvolt came about. So they moved back to Europe and started Northvolt towards late 2016. As a company, we brought in more than $6.5 billion of investments. We've been fortunate to have a lot of the well-established car manufacturers on board from an early stage. BMW was perhaps the first one in 2018. Volkswagen is a big both customer and investor in Northvolt. And most recently, we announced a joint venture together with Volvo Cars with the aim to build another one of these gigafactories.
In its quest for sovereignty, Europe is encouraging the multiplication of mining projects to supply new battery factories. For cobalt, deposits have been identified in Sweden, Norway, and particularly in Finland. 2 nickel and cobalt mines are currently active in this country. 7 other projects are in development, boasting dozens of battery ore deposits. Finland has opened up huge portions of its land to mining exploration. The country is the only member of the European Union whose soil contains all the minerals needed to make batteries. 300 kilometers from the Arctic Circle, the Terrafame company has restarted production at the former Sotkamo mine, which was closed in 2012 after toxic water leaked into the region's lakes and rivers. The Finnish government is piloting Terrafame alongside Trafigura, a commodities trader convicted of pollution in Africa. The Finnish company also supplies Renault with nickel for the batteries of its electric vehicles.
What we produce here in Terrafame is the battery chemicals, so it's a nickel sulfate and cobalt sulfate that we produce from the raw materials that we mine ourselves. So we have a mining, bio-leaching, and then we produce further into the battery chemicals. If you look at cobalt, the production capacity is 7,400 tons battery-grade cobalt sulfate, again for battery application, and which is roughly for 300,000 electrical vehicles per annum.
The European Commission plans to have at least 30 million electric vehicles on its roads by 2030. For cobalt alone, it would take 10 projects like Terrafame to get there. Europe will never be a cobalt El Dorado, but there is one sector where it can play a significant role: recycling. By 2035, the batteries in all electric cars sold in the European Union should contain at least 20% recycled cobalt. Volkswagen has launched a dedicated factory, while future European heavyweights in battery production, such as Verkor in France and Northvolt in Sweden, have integrated this into the launch of their gigafactory.
These raw materials that we need for battery metals, they are recyclable by nature, and you can recycle them over and over again. So it's really about mining them once and then using them forever. And that is the fundamental difference in this change here. And obviously, given at the speed we're growing this market currently, it's going to take a few decades. It's going to take a while to get to a point where you have a set market, one car in, one car out type of market. But once you get there, you could obviously have a very circular feed of raw materials.
Those batteries will be recycled in Europe and they'll be fed into the European supply chain, which means that over time, because of that recycling loop, countries and regions will have a reduced dependence on African minerals.
Following Amnesty International's 2016 report, companies in the mining sector were forced to clean up their supply chains. At a special forum in Kolwezi in 2019, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, brought mining companies together to help them better track their cobalt. Its solution? Due diligence.
Due diligence is a process whereby companies are supposed to map their supply chains or other business relationships and operations and identify in what ways those business relationships or supply chains might be linked to human rights abuses. Due diligence also involves mitigating those risks.
In this new market of due diligence, companies like RCS Global have gained vast power. But how do you ensure true traceability in the face of ever-changing artisanal mines and a complex supply chain?
As I said before, the Volkswagen Group does not currently buy cobalt, but we get the material through the supply chains of our cell suppliers. The cobalt supply chain for us when we buy the battery cells is very non-transparent, because in the supply chain, we are several steps away from the mining directly. And the supply chain intermediary partners are often located in China, for example, where we don't know exactly how the suppliers trade. And of course, you also have to understand that a supply chain is not static. Companies also change their suppliers and sub-suppliers, which is what we want in order to achieve the best prices, for example. And that's why it's relatively opaque, because there are just so many partners in the supply chain. And at the same time, it's constantly changing, which also keeps the process opaque.
There are different ways in which the downstream companies try to dodge their responsibility. One of those is to hire consultants, expensive consultants, who basically conduct the due diligence themselves, do the reporting, and they're almost at arm's length from the company itself. The other thing that companies do is join industry schemes. So they join up with all the other companies in their sector, and they create a body which does the due diligence for them, or promotes a set of standards which they all sign up to. And then it's just a paper exercise. They can all say, yes, we agree with these standards, we've signed up to these standards. But it doesn't necessarily lead to the change we want to see on the ground.
Child labor has been getting a lot of attention, and rightly so. There are still thousands of children on the artisanal sites in Lualaba. But many NGOs believe that this phenomenon has overshadowed other problems caused by industrial mining, which due diligence is struggling to address. These include forced displacement of populations without proper compensation, pollution, and finally, corruption. The plundering of Congolese mineral resources is not new. For more than 60 years, colonial Belgium extracted vast wealth here. After the Congo's independence in 1960, a new form of predation was established. The dictator Mobutu and his relatives drew billions from the assets of Zajtman, the state-owned mining company. When Laurent Désiré Kabila overthrew Mobutu in 1997, the bankrupt country plunged back into war. After his assassination, his son Joseph Kabila succeeded him. He signed peace deals and revived the mining sector to refill the state coffers. But Zajtman was left in ruins.
In 2002, we all noticed that Zajtman had gone bankrupt, just as the Congolese state had also gone bankrupt, economically and in other ways. And the World Bank initiated or advised the Congolese state to make reforms because they said you have the minerals, but you do not have the means to make the sector reliable. You have to open up the multinationals. The mining operators came. The multinationals came to the Congo, like Glencore, First Quantum. Big ones have come here. They did not come for the development of the people. They came to do business.
To understand the cobalt sector today, you have to go back in time. You have to look at how the companies that are present today acquired the mining concessions, especially the cobalt concessions. And what we can see is that there was a really decisive, crucial role played by an Israeli businessman named Dan Gertler, who in fact played the role of intermediary between the multinationals who were looking for these concessions rich in copper and cobalt on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Congolese politicians who had the power to decide on the granting of these concessions. What happened was that the state company instead made contracts, what we call amicable agreements, contracts directly with this Israeli businessman, who was very much connected to Joseph Kabila, very close to the former president of the DRC, and sold these concessions at very low prices.
As soon as he took power in 2001, Joseph Kabila made Dan Gertler his most trusted man. Gertler landed in Congo with new money at a time when the country was in dire need of it. He became the key to Western companies' access to Kabila. In 2007, the world leader in commodities trading, Glencore, called on him to acquire the best deposits. They became co-shareholders in Mutanda Mining, the largest cobalt mine in the world. Glencore also advanced millions of dollars to Gertler in exchange for his mediation with Kinshasa for another mining contract. Once revealed in the press, this transaction drew the attention of the American authorities. They suspect the businessmen of having bribed the Kabila regime in several projects, some of which even involved an American investment fund. In total, The NGOs estimate that the Congolese state has lost more than $1 billion in these transactions. Trouble then began for Gertler.
And so, as a result of this, he was placed under the sanctions, and other actors were also placed, certain high officers of the Kabila regime, and others as well. But certainly he is the largest was the largest target in terms of value of the assets he controlled.
To get back into the Congolese game, the U.S. has targeted Dan Gertler to push Kabila out. They sued Glencore, which is also under investigation in the UK and Switzerland. In 2022, Glencore announced it was setting aside $1.5 billion to settle its legal cases. How do manufacturers like Umicore, who buy cobalt from the Swiss giant, position themselves?
If there is a conviction, we would need to assess what is happening. We will do our own assessment as well. If a judge finds that a party is guilty, we will look into it and then make our decision, of course, yeah, based on the legal outcome.
For us, it's quite disappointing. It's like if you say a company that mines or buys, that buys artisanal ore, that was made with child labor on site. You say yes, but in fact, the company has not been convicted for using children, and therefore there is no problem. You see, it's a bit like that for child labor in the mines. You would never use that argument. They haven't been convicted, so there's no problem. Apparently, for corruption, as long as you are not convicted, there is no problem.
It is clear to us that corruption is not a victimless crime. And so often that's how it's portrayed. It is money passing hands between middlemen and corrupt elite officials. But of course, at the end of that chain are frequently ordinary citizens who suffer quite dramatically as a result of the corruption. And the corruption around the metal coal mine was no exception.
The metal coal mine is made up of the Kolwezi mine waste piled up for miles during Belgian colonial exploitation. It is in fact one of the richest sites in the copper belt. In the early 2000s, the Canadian company First Quantum obtained the rights to exploit them. It was the deal of the century. These piles of waste are said to contain another 300,000 tons of cobalt. That makes them worth $20 billion. But suddenly, the Kabila regime withdrew the mining license from First Quantum.
We now know from court documents and court records what happened. And what occurred is that the mining license had been stripped through the assistance of a company owned by Dan Gertler, who saw this as a very profitable mine. He held it for a short period of time and then flipped it to a large multinational mining company, then called Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation, today called Eurasian Resources Group, or ERG. And that company owns the mine today, but we know through court records it was a mine that was corrupted away by Dan Gertler, bribing Congolese officials, including Congolese judges, in order to obtain the mining permit.
The Kazakh group Eurasian Resources Group, through its subsidiary Metal Coal, is finishing the construction of the plant and operating the site. Despite Metal Coal's commitments, the 700 employees laid off by First Quantum will not be rehired or compensated.
But is this sand here?
It's not sand, it's waste.
It's the waste from the ore?
Yes, it's ore. You can see, it's shining.
Projects like the metal call are not ethical for us. This is why we wanted to take legal action. It's an appeal to the collective conscience, that is to say, of all the stakeholders, the final consumers, the international NGOs, the multinationals. We cannot be satisfied with them consuming our cobalt and exploiting us at the same time, without looking at the living conditions of the populations that take part in the extraction of these minerals. I hope that through this cause, Through this commitment, we will have sensitized all the other stakeholders on the real problems that plague the cobalt mining sector, rather than focusing on the issue of children in the mines. I do not deny that it is a problem, but it is not the biggest problem of the sector.
Hapa huku tribunal. Munachunga nini?
Arranger le dossier. Ile makuta barikatalaka chimi jinga ure baturipe makuta yetu diku banaanza kutulipa na 600 francs. Ile 600,000 banaanza kutukabri. Eske ndio wanalipaka pension ya mtu.
Kajiranzo nileta makuta kuripia kwa batoto ku masomo, mi mwenyewe hospital, mi shina na hospital. Seke ni mangaiko ya nguvu. Iraanza kunisaidia ako na kupeleka ko dimu kumisa. Mi nashindwa na kupeleka dimu. Tapata kaji wapi mi shina.
At that time when we worked, we had access to medical care. We earned the wages to pay for schooling for our children. But suddenly, when the work stopped, my daughter suffered. So I did everything I could to go to the hospital where we were treated. I was turned away. You have no right to come here. So on the way back, she died. And the boy died after a year. My daughter is here. Her name was Martha.
Marta.
Yes. She was suffering from the disease of malaria. He is here.
What was his name?
His name was René.
René.
Yes.
And what happened to him?
He had malaria and yellow fever. He also died. He was 8 years old.
Welcome, everyone, to our radio television Manika program. We are going to talk about the ecosystem. What impact does mining have on the surrounding population? And for that, we have Professor Banza, toxicologist and professor at the University of Lubumbashi. Professor, first tell us what your mission was here in Kolwezi.
We started with the assessment of the levels of contamination of the ecosystems of the populations. That is to say, what are the levels of contamination of the waterways? The levels of contamination of the fish that are consumed, and that are in the waterways that are contaminated, and that also affect the consumers. The levels of human contamination from the consumption of fish, from the inhalation of dust, and from the contamination of the environment in which we are living.
Professor Celestine Banza has been investigating environmental and health impacts of mining in the Congo for the past 15 years alongside NGOs, an area where polluting companies apply incomplete due diligence.
Which company is behind this ecological disaster?
First, it's the KCC company, which belongs to Glencore. This foam here is the lime. When they see that the basin is full, they open this pipe. This is what causes the change in the color of the water, but also the foam that comes from the lime that they are pouring into the basin.
When they put lime in to increase the acidity and keep the pH above 7. But I don't think they solved the problem because the toxic metals. The acid persists. Look at the appearance of the water and even the soils. the sedimentation sludge, the color of which shows that there is still a very serious pollution problem. And so the problem is very, very important, especially since this river flows into the Congo River. This is one of the most important rivers in Africa. It feeds a sizable part of our country.
Under pressure from NGOs, Glencore finally acknowledged the sulfuric acid leaks, but it denied any impact on the surrounding ponds. Paradoxically, the company has begun to compensate victims and to start rehabilitating the fish ponds. In 2008, Professor Bonza and his team demonstrated very high levels of cobalt in the blood and urine of Kolwezi miners. Their article, published by the prestigious group Nature, showed changes of the DNA of children exposed to mineral dust, an indication of a high risk of cancer in the future. Now, he is conducting tests on 100 diggers in the pits. They are exposed to radon, a radioactive and carcinogenic gas emitted from the uranium also present in the rock.
If we don't manage the pollution properly, as it has been done so far, it will become a problem. It will be a problem because the rivers will be almost destroyed. Most of the rivers in the province of Grand Katanga, for example, are already hit by pollution. And not only here in Katanga. We have seen this in Kivu. The same thing is almost all over the country. Where there is extraction of mineral resources, there are still problems. So if we're not careful, the country risks an ecological and toxicological scandal.
Known as the land of 1,000 lakes, Finland is not only the mineral reserve of Europe, it is also one of its primary sources of fresh water, a key resource under threat for the Finns who are highly concerned about the effects of mining on the environment. In 2012, 1,000 hectares of rivers and lakes were destroyed by a leak of toxic water from the Sotkamo mine, owned at the time by the company Talvivaara. Under popular pressure, the state closed the mine before restarting operations through the Terrafame company. Environmental activist Mika Floyd investigated the 2012 disaster. Outraged by the negligence of the mine's former owners, he was one of the activists who called for its closure.
We were concerned about the Terrafame at that time. It was called Talvivaara mine. We were concerned about its impact to the waters. And they stated that it's a bioleaching and the most environmental friendly mine in the world, and they don't release any wastewater, etc. Those were the marketing lines to the local politicians and regional politicians and people, that why they should support this huge mine.
The first thing we did was that we built a central water treatment plant. This is a known best available technology. Central water treatment plant, as well as then a discharge pipeline from the central water treatment plant all the way to the big water ways. And we started to purify the water so that we can, when it's raining heavily, it doesn't impact, it doesn't in a way disturb the production. We purify the water and release it. Bioleaching, which is a technology that they invested and built here, was not operating steadily during their time. So we have done a lot of further development to make it work in a stable manner. But the basic ideas are the same as they had.
Mika Floyd is suspicious of the industry's claims. So is Jari Natunen, a geochemist and head of the Mining Watch Finland Association. Together, they monitor the area surrounding the mine operated by Terrafame.
And then they say they're humic substances. But when it's in this stream, it's always nickel above the environmental quality standard, and probably cadmium too. They're many times what you're allowed to put into nature.
The presence of heavy metals is confirmed by official analyses known to Terrafame. The company acknowledges that a leak did occur in 2020, which it says has been resolved. As for the concentrations found today by Jari Natunen, Terrafame believes that they are of natural origin. The biochemist remains skeptical. A water treatment pipe can still break, and mining waste can still spill into the ground.
So here's the biggest problem with this mine. There's the waste rock that contains 9% sulfur. And that sulfur reacts with water and air. So if we have a ton of this waste rock, then for every ton of waste rock that reacts with water and air, 300 kilos of concentrated sulfuric acid are produced. And that goes on for thousands of years, as long as that rock is there. Here the pro-miners say, NIMBY, not in my backyard. So now I would like to ask who wants a 300-kilogram hazardous waste landfill in their backyard, which would destroy the environment and pollute it. It's just illegal, and you shouldn't do that.
That's right.
And then if we think about this electric car, cobalt and nickel, it means that here, every year, 50 tons of this hazardous waste is produced for the nickel in one electric car battery.
Shocking.
50 tons for nickel in one electric car battery. And would the car buyer want this hazardous waste delivered alongside his car in his backyard?
In southeastern Finland, near Lake Saimaa, the country's largest lake, 10 mining permits have been issued in less than 2 years. Misa Mink became an activist in reaction to the expansion of mining in the protected natural areas of her region, classified as Natura 2000. She remembers an older pollution incident in the 1990s related to the exploitation of a cobalt mine that killed the life of a lake.
There are no closed-circuit wells in Finland. If the starting point for mines is that at least some of the toxins are discharged into our waterways, then we can think about what the country will look like 100 or 200 years from now. It is currently predicted that the demand for these battery materials will have to increase 30-fold by 2040 if we want to meet the emissions targets set by the Paris Agreement. So that's a pretty amazing figure. There are currently 9 metal ore mines in Finland. So you can do a quick calculation to see what it will look like in 2040 if we become the ore hub of Europe. The EU wants to reduce its dependence on material flows from Congo and China, which is of course quite right, because of course the situation there is even worse, certainly in terms of responsibility. And this was the reason why we launched the Limits to Mining initiative. Thank you very much for that. And last night, we reached the 50,000 limit. So this bill will be discussed in Parliament.
Päiväksi otettavaksi. Itke meidän järvi. Itke meidän järvi. Itke meidän itkettäessä.
it's in the interest of the planet for people to be driving electric vehicles. If you're going to get a car, well, I would say get a bike. But if you want to get a car, get an electric car rather than a diesel or petrol-powered one in the interest of the planet and future generations. That's fine, but if you do that, ask the car maker, what goes into your battery? What are you doing to make sure that the mining that pulls out the metals that goes into that battery, what are you doing to make sure that's not harmful, that that's not harming the people of the DRC or other countries where this mining takes place?
In the Congo, the new president Felix Tshisekedi succeeded Kabila in 2018. He promised the renegotiation of mining contracts, but the process drags on and the population still does not benefit from the wealth of their own country. In the meantime, Congolese minerals and those from around the world will continue to feed the hundreds of millions of electric cars planned for our roads. But all over the world, voices are being raised. Activists, lawyers, and scientists are investigating and getting organized against the mining industry. The political world can no longer ignore their voices.
General Motorola, Nokia, Samsung, Huawei, Tesla, BMW, General Motorola, Chopé, allez deux.